What's good, guys, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Marcello. If you're not new here, my name is still Marcello. I talk about books with a focus on 90s kids books, at least so far. And in this set of videos, I am recapping and reviewing the Animorphs books from beginning to end, no matter how long it takes. And I'm assigning ratings throughout, and eventually I'm gonna have a scientific ranking of each book in the series, and the mystery of which Animorphs book is the best will finally be solved with science. This is episode 2, and it's gonna cover book 2 in the series, The Visitor. The Visitor was published in June of 1996, and it was written by K.A. herself, no ghostwriter for this book. The front cover quote is, "No one knows who they are," and in the inside front cover it says, "9 lives are better than one." The cover shows Rachel morphing into a cat, only depicting her face, as is also the case in The Invasion. And this is going to stop in book 3 when Dave Mattingly starts illustrating the books, and we're going to see the full bodies of each of the morphs. This book does have a direct adaptation in the Animorphs TV series, which I am going to be talking about at some point. Spoiler alert, I really like the series. And the events of this book take place about a week after the events of The Invasion. So The Visitor is the first book narrated by Rachel, and it does a great job expanding on the preview we got into her internal struggles in The Invasion and setting us up for her continued growth in future novels. Recap first and then we'll talk numbers. The book opens with Rachel and Tobias in flight, not insignificant since we've already gotten some hints as to their hidden mutual affection. Rachel's in bald eagle morph, struggling to find a natural rhythm to her flight, but Tobias is coaching her through. Morph autonomy is a big theme throughout The Visitor, and this foreshadows a much heavier incident later in the series. Autonomy in general is a theme throughout the books for obvious reasons, the Yeerks taking autonomy from people, and it starts to become very apparent in this book. Anyway, the rest of the Animorphs are flying with Rachel and Tobias, and as they soar, some errant humans shoot at them, and they take the guys' guns and fly off, with Cassie reminding them that it's been nearly 2 hours and they should demorph. As they demorph, Rachel tells the reader that it's easier to morph back to human than it is into an animal, which is new information for us. And Jake notes out loud that he now feels as if they're tethered to the ground, something that's likely either for Tobias's benefit or for our benefit, so that we don't feel too bad for Tobias too early, because there's still so much more angst to come. Rachel describes how most people think she's pretty, but she doesn't care. She's more focused on what's in people's heads. Or birds' heads, perhaps. On a totally unrelated note, she tells the reader about Tobias's Nothlit status. As the gang walks home, we also learn that they can't communicate with Tobias when they are not in morph, contradicting The Invasion. I'm reading first editions in case this isn't clear. Anyway, the thought speak rules will remain consistent throughout the rest of the series. The rest of the chapter continues to debrief the reader on the current state of affairs. Elthanger, Visser Three, Tom, the Yeerk pool and its associated horrors. Rachel tells the gang how the night prior she had a nightmare that she was stuck in the Yeerk pool, and Cassie brings up how the only thing worse than the screams is the sudden calm that overcomes the hosts as they take control of their bodies. I love how this forces the reader to take a pause and really consider again what these books are actually about. The Animorphs start to brainstorm their next move, Jake mentioning that the entrance they used in The Invasion has been closed, and Rachel states during planning that the Yeerks definitely still think that they're Andalites, signaling to the reader that we should not be worried about how overt their morphing was at the Yeerk pool in the last book. As they continue to think, they toss around the idea of using Chapman to locate other entrances. He is, after all, the one who led them to the first one, and Rachel's friends with Chapman's daughter, Melissa, and could use her to try to get information. Rachel doesn't like this idea, and she argues that she doesn't want to get Melissa involved, which Jake shuts down by pointing out that her dad is Chapman, so she's involved whatever Rachel decides. There's a good chance she's a controller already. Rachel knows that Jake is right, but she lets us know that it makes her feel like dirt. We'll put a pin in this moment, Rachel having such a strong moral objection to such a small act of moral relativism, because as the series progresses, the moral objections will decrease and the level of moral transgression that Rachel engages in will not. For now, though, we are in book 2, and Rachel is a strong-willed but still compassionate and humanitarian warrior who still slights at the thought of collateral damage. The next day, Rachel is going to her gymnastics class at the YMCA, which Melissa Chapman also attends, and Rachel notes that Melissa looks like an elf from a Tolkien book, so Lord of the Rings exists in this universe, which is fun. Rachel also notices that there's been something off about Melissa lately. Her smiles have seemed hollow. Rachel tries to talk to her, but Melissa shuts her down, and Rachel feels like a jerk because Melissa used to be her friend, and obviously something has been going on, but Rachel didn't even notice, and now she's only pretending to care so that she can get close to her father. And out of context, that line definitely could have been from American Beauty. Anyway, Rachel is now starting to suspect that her friend may be a controller. On the way home from gymnastics, some guy hassles her, and Rachel morphs Elephant, stopping about halfway through before he reaches her. He runs home, still no concern that a Yeerk may infest this dude, and Rachel continues to walk home, barefoot now because she's broken her shoes. And Melissa and Chapman pull up and they force her to accept a ride home in their car, asking her about the guy who just ran off, which is weird to me because the events with this random dude took a few minutes to unfold, and the way that it's told, it appears that Melissa and her father were just watching everything go down from their car and letting Rachel take matters into her own hands. They drive her home without anything eventful happening, and at home Rachel has some nice regular interactions with her mom. These don't happen too often in the series, but they are peppered in enough to highlight the contrast between the life the Animorphs live and the regular day-to-day life that they only pretend to live. Later, Cassie, Marco, and Jake come to Rachel's house. She tells them about the interaction with the random creepy guy, which she rationalizes by saying that the Yeerks wouldn't make a controller out of a punk, an argument that I find ridiculous. The Yeerks want to enslave humanity because of the numbers, and although Rachel doesn't know that, to assume that just because a guy is a predator or a creep, he will never be of any use to any Yeerk is foolish. The gang tells her as much, and she acknowledges the screw-up. And as she does, she feels sick of all the lies that she's had to wrap herself in lately. Lies to Melissa, lies to her mother. She tells another lie of omission as she leaves out the part where Chapman and Melissa may have seen something in the alleyway that day. The gang continues to try to think of ways to progress in their battle with the Yeerks, deciding that their next best course of action would be to investigate Chapman's office, like in his house. If they morph small enough animals, they can break in and stake it out, and bada bing, bada boom, maybe he leads them right to the Yeerk pool again. They are thinking of what animal to morph when Rachel's mind starts to wander, and as she gazes over the pictures on her desk, she sees something. It's a picture of her and Melissa's cat, and suddenly their path forward becomes clear. Cut to the gang at the Chapman household. The cat's name is Fluffer. Rachel describes him to Tobias, who takes to the skies to search the surrounding area for him. He's able to locate Fluffer pretty quickly, conveying to the group how easy it is to see all the prey animals around. He starts to describe them as appetizing before catching himself and stopping, embarrassed, and Marco tells him that he doesn't know if he can have someone who eats rats for a friend, and Rachel tells him to shut up. It's only been a week of full-time hawk life for Tobias at this point, so the group is trying to be extremely sensitive to him. Marco apologizes in his own way. I think of the entire group, Marco and Tobias are probably the furthest apart personality-wise. Even Marco and Cassie have some moments of camaraderie, mostly because of their mutual love for Jake, but Marco and Tobias are virtually always at odds. So Tobias flies off to lead them to the cat for them to acquire, which proves more difficult than anticipated. Ultimately, in true Animorphs fashion, they come up with a very convoluted plan that needlessly risks someone's life in morph. This will become a trend. In this iteration, Tobias flies off to catch a mouse, which Rachel will then morph as bait to lure a cat down from the tree that he's in, and then one of the other Animorphs will capture the cat, and then Rachel will acquire the cat and then sneak into Chapman's house. So Tobias winds up bringing them a shrew by mistake, and as Rachel morphs, Tobias tells her in private thought speak to be careful because he doesn't want anything to happen to her, and she winks at him. Just throwing that in there. So Rachel morphs Shrew and immediately loses control. The Shrew is a prey animal, and she's overwhelmed by its desire to find somewhere safe and enclosed and away from all the giant mammals that comprise the Animorphs. Rachel makes a point of telling the reader that she's considering eating maggots, something which I think KA put in there to normalize Tobias's future behavior, or like fluff us a little bit for it. Rachel's running around the yard in a prey animal panic when Tobias swoops out of the sky and carries her away in his claws, thought speaking her back to her rational mind in the process. Rachel describes this as a switch being flipped in her brain. Back in her right mind, the convoluted plan continues as they migrate to the tree where Rachel is supposed to lure Fluffer down. This plan works, of course, and Rachel is ultimately able to acquire Melissa Chapman's cat. In human form, Rachel recalls the Shrew's fear and vows to avoid morphing prey animals ever again. Jake expresses some guilt that Rachel is now all freaked out, telling her that he shouldn't have let her morph the Shrew, but Rachel, true to form, tells him that she does what she wants. After the acquisition, Rachel decides that she doesn't really feel up for the mission that night, and the gang releases Fluffer before they go home. Rain check. Rachel has a nightmare that night, and after she wakes up, she talks to her little sister Jordan, who asks Rachel if she would tell her if something were seriously wrong. Rachel lies to her and admits to herself that even now she can't trust that Jordan isn't a controller prying for information. This is a pretty harsh thing to need to reckon with, and it's admirable that Rachel's come to terms with this possibility so early. Rachel tells the reader that in her dream, she was a shrew eating maggots off the corpse of a dead cat. Fascinating symbolism here. What could this mean? There's an obvious fear of being trapped in morph, specifically of needing to adopt the diet of an animal. I initially thought that this might be to prepare us for Tobias's eventual decision to do this, but I'm starting to think that it may be the opposite. This may be to prep us for just how big of a deal converting to the hawk diet will be for Tobias. This is wise because I think a lot of the kids reading Animorphs for the first time might not get the full gravity of Tobias's decision to eat rats in the next book. It's kind of the difference between you eating rats is gross and this human has made a fundamental sacrifice of their self-identity in the name of survival. Back to Rachel, this dream is also significant for her because the shrew is a prey animal. It's genetically wired through generations of evolution to handle danger by running and hiding from it, something entirely antithetical to what we know of Rachel's character, at least so far. This dream serves to highlight the gravity and the risk the Animorphs take every time they morph, as well as the actual trauma involved in the morphs themselves, even when they're executed successfully and safely. The next day, Jake tells Rachel about how he had nightmares after he morphed Lizard. He said he didn't have them after he morphed Tiger, and Rachel thinks about about how she had the same experience with the elephant. They conclude that some animals are just good matches for human brains while others aren't. They both vocalize that they really don't want to morph bugs, which at this point we know is a direct signal that they will be morphing bugs in the very near future. Later, Rachel sees Melissa crying and approaches her to comfort her and also to fish for information. Melissa's dismissive of her concern, making vague, angsty, blanket statements about how nothing is wrong, but everything is wrong. She's mad at Rachel for not hanging out with her and starts to say something about her parents before running off. As Rachel leaves this encounter, she runs into Chapman, who germanely asks if she's been having bad dreams lately, and reminds her that nightmares aren't real. A little on the nose, but is anything more terrifying than a vice principal who is also some type of alien war captain hell-bent on destroying your friends and enslaving your species? I don't think I've ever said out loud how much I appreciate Chapman's character, but I really appreciate Chapman's character. I think he was a great choice. 2 nights later, the gang reconvenes outside Chapman's house. Tobias is there to keep an eye on Fluffer and to make sure that Rachel has ample notice to get out of there if Fluffer decides to make a return home. In the pre-mission debrief, Rachel says something about possibly helping Melissa, and Marco takes pains to remind her that the mission is to find a Yeerkpool entrance, not to help this human girl navigate her personal issues. Jake tells him that she doesn't need this reminder, and Marco makes a joke about detention, prompting Rachel to tell the reader that while Marco can be obnoxious, he does have a gift for making people laugh when they need it most. Someone on the Animorphs subreddit once asked what people's favorite character relationship was, and I remember putting Marco and Rachel high on that list. They're both intelligent and pragmatic in their own ways, with Rachel opting for the path of least resistance and Marco usually taking some more time to make a plan, but both capable of making hard decisions. Both are also very clear-eyed about the stakes of the fight that they're in, and although their respective stakes make them respond to it differently, they often end up in the same place, at least in terms of decision making. So Tobias gives the all clear and Rachel morphs Fluffer. She finds the cat mind much more amenable to her natural disposition, and after attempting to attack Tobias out of the sky, she is able to achieve full control. She describes to the group how she feels like a gunslinger in an old Clint Eastwood movie, and Marco prudently advises her to keep a little of her good old human fear intact for this mission. Cassie echoes this statement, stating that between the cat's attitude and Rachel's natural attitude, things could get out of hand pretty quickly, and Rachel reassures them that she's in full control, but confides in the reader that she isn't. She's letting some of the cat's arrogance in intentionally. Perhaps this is to compensate for the fear she felt as the shrew, or perhaps Rachel's real fear is that the prey animal morphs will have a longer-term impact on who she is, and she's trying to supplement with some predator animals. In either case, Rachel makes her way into the Chapman house with only a few feline distractions along the way. Inside, she sees Melissa doing math homework, struggling aloud, notably not very controller-like, before locating Chapman. Chapman goes into the basement, and Rachel follows him, noting that her communication with Tobias is growing faint as she does so. The basement is your typical finished basement game room with a couch and a pool table, but Rachel notices that there are very few human scents down there, as if no one has been down there for a while. As she watches, Chapman approaches a small white door in the corner of the basement. Behind it is a steel door, and behind that is a secret room. Chapman enters, and Rachel slips in behind him, noting that both her human and cat minds feel some trepidation about this decision. The new room is dark, but a light quickly snaps on and takes the form of Visser Three. Rachel witnesses a conference between hologram Visser and Chapman. The conference is mostly about the Andalite bandits, and we learn that the Council of 13, presumably the Yeerk's governing body, will be angry with Visser Three if they hear of the trouble on Earth. Apparently, Visser Three lied to them and told them that all the Andalites were destroyed. Visser Three is passing the pressure he feels from the council down to Chapman, who is quivering in fear, and Rachel can smell the fear on him, and she's starting to notice another smell that she's struggling to identify. Presumably this is a Yeerk, when she hears Visser Three ask Chapman what that small animal is in the room with him. Rachel has been spotted. The Visser orders that Chapman kill the cat out of an abundance of caution, and he swipes at it with his hologram tail, causing Cat Rachel to attack it back. Chapman pushes back a little bit, telling the Visser that this is his host child's animal, and killing it might violate his cover. Rachel says that the Visser doesn't look too happy, but that he was not a creature who made impetuous decisions, something which is demonstrably false. Maybe Rachel just hasn't learned this yet, since we're only on book 2, but Visser 3 is the king of impetuous decisions. Impetuous meaning quickly and without thought or care. I mean, this is the guy who made the executive order to eat the general of his opposing army rather than make him a controller or like a prisoner of war or anything like that. He will make more impetuous decisions down the line, and I'm now gonna have to point all of them out. Anyway, Visser 3 decides to let the cat live until we've resolved the matter of the girl, which causes Chapman's face to twitch. More on that later. Controller Chapman points out that they promised human Chapman they'd leave his daughter alone, but Visser 3 correctly points out that the arrangements they reach with voluntary hosts are just tools, just like Chapman is Visser 3's tool. Visser 3 morphs some giant alien creature that is apparently capable of sucking yeerks out of their controllers' heads and shows Chapman a video of him doing just that before telling him that he'd better get his shit together. He hangs up and Mrs. Chapman shows up asking what the Visser's orders are. Chapman explains that Visser 3 just morphed a Varynx, a yeerk bane, and Mrs. Chapman says that she always thought that this was a myth that Visser 3 told his troops just to keep them scared, and Chapman tells her that he saw the video, which causes Mrs. Chapman to balk at what a bold, quick, and careless move that was. The two have a chat where they basically talk about how impetuous Visser 3 is and wish that he falls from grace before they're interrupted by Melissa. She needs help with her homework, and both yeerks snap into human mode, but they're poor replacements for true parents, and it's clear that Melissa knows this. She retreats to her room to cry, and Cat Rachel follows up to comfort her. As she purrs in Melissa's lap, Melissa starts to ask the cat why her parents don't love her anymore. Tobias is outside yelling at Rachel that she has a job to do. She is specifically not there to comfort Melissa Chapman, and in this moment as Melissa cries, Rachel realizes what she's really fighting for, and the loss that will come with the Yeerk invasion. It's about more than just the enslaved humans, it's about their loved ones and all that they've built towards. As a man who recently gave birth, as a man who just had his first child, I can relate to this. I can now relate to all things as a man who's just had a child, in fact. I'm being facetious. Anyway, Rachel makes it with 10 minutes to spare, and as Jake reprimands her, she shares what she's learned. She also tells them that she's made a decision. She doesn't care what it takes or how many risks she has to run. Rachel will find a way to stop the Yeerks. She does not tell them that Visser 3 caught her and almost had her killed. The next day at school, Rachel is barely able to get any work done, and she tells us how her grades have started to slip for the first time because of how busy she's been saving the world. Rachel thinks about how she now knows what went wrong with Melissa's life. Both of her parents became controllers, and Melissa was able to tell that their love for her was no longer real. Tragic. Rachel thinks about how when her parents divorced, she was worried that they wouldn't love her anymore, but even though she doesn't see her dad as much, it is still very clear to her that he still loves her. This book really sneaks in some great and necessary messages for kids. Thinking of Melissa deprived of love and not knowing why makes Rachel furious. The gang meets up later, and as they demorph from birds, Marco is talking about how they should have some type of uniform or at least consistency in the way they dress like the X-Men do, and Rachel points out that they're not in a comic book, something that gave me a chuckle when I read the graphic novel, which is excellent. As the gang begins to discuss the matter at hand, Rachel wants to return to Chapman's to eavesdrop some more and to see if she can learn the location of the Kendrona, the Yeerk sun that powers the Yeerk pool. She reasons that Chapman is their only lead, so they should extract as much as they can from him. Tobias privately questions whether Rachel is purely motivated by this goal, but since she's in human form, she can't respond to him. Rachel also notes to the reader at this point that she hasn't told anyone about the Visser's suspicion on her last visit. Cassie, intuitive as she is, has picked up on Rachel's deception, and she also questions Rachel, but Rachel denies that anything went wrong. Cassie jokingly suggests that someone more flee and ride in on her back, and the group concedes to let her go back one more time. As they end the conversation, Tobias tells Rachel that he knows she's just going back there because she wants to help Melissa. I'd just like to take a moment to point out, as I probably will in every one of these videos, that there are better alternatives to this plan. And in case it isn't too obvious, someone's gonna more flee and ride in on Rachel whether she likes it or not. And if they're prepared to do that, then why aren't they prepared to explore other options or other morphs to get into Chapman's basement? Surely there are other small animals that would escape Chapman's notice, be relatively safe, and be able to interpret human speech, maybe? The next chapter starts with, "It was a dark and stormy night." Sorry, I've always wanted to write that, but it really was a dark and stormy night. And this little snippet is 100% KA writing to the audience, and it makes me smile. Anyway, the next night, it is dark and stormy, apparently, and the gang is once again at Chapman's house, minus Jake, who had to stay home because he's grounded, definitely. Rachel is beginning to feel off about this entire thing, but she decides to press on anyway. So she does the same thing as last time and winds up in the basement with Chapman again, and as she's slipping into the secret room, she hears Jake's thoughts speak in her head. He has, as we suspected, morphed Flea and is currently stationed on Rachel's back. We learn that the Flea morph is so limited in terms of its senses that it's actually a very easy and not altogether unpleasant morph, which is good knowledge for later, as we probably know that the Flea becomes a very useful morph for the Animorphs. Anyway, Rachel is mad that Jake deceived her, along with apparently the rest of the group who are in on this plan, but there's not much to be done about it, so she gets to the dirty business of telling Jake what really happened last time she was in the basement. Jake does not take this well. We can picture that vein bulging in his Flea forehead, but Chapman interrupts them by addressing the Visser. He debriefs Visser 3 on 4 new voluntary hosts, 2 of whom are children and 1 of whom is an FBI agent, but Visser 3 doesn't care. He only wants to know about the Andalite bandits. At this point, Chapman accidentally kicks Cat Rachel and she lets out a yowl, alerting Visser 3 to her presence, and he decides that now is the time to kill the cat. Apparently its presence twice in a row is too much to be a coincidence. Chapman subdues Cat Rachel, which I honestly find dubious. Have any of you ever tried to catch a cat? Unless this basement was very small, I would put money on the cat, although I suppose the room that they're in is probably quite small. Regardless, I don't envy Chapman this task. Once Rachel Rachel's been subdued, Visser Three tells Chapman that they're going to deal with the Andalite bandit and Melissa, Chapman's daughter. Visser Three prudently points out that it's because of the girl that the Andalite bandits have been able to penetrate their home, because the cat is the girl's pet. I think it's fair to say that it's the girl's fault the Animorphs didn't just morph mice or something more convenient, but this seems to be a little bit of a stretch. In either case, the Visser orders Chapman to bring his host daughter and the cat to him. Once Visser Three is off the call, Chapman addresses Rachel directly. We learn that it's not easy being Visser Three's subordinate. We also learn that having an uncooperative host can actually be pretty disruptive for a host Yeerk. As Chapman gives Rachel his speech, he's suddenly overtaken by a fit of twitching, which Mrs. Chapman characterizes as host rebellion before joining him. Rachel, watching, relates to fighting the shrew instincts earlier in the book. After they've regained control, the Chapmans discuss how their hosts refuse to stop fighting for their child, and how while they'll never regain their bodies back entirely, there is a very real risk of them seizing control at a very inopportune time and blowing the Yeerks' cover. If Visser Three takes Melissa, any leverage the Yeerks were using to keep the host Chapmans in check will no longer exist. Chekhov's gun has been loaded. Chapman escapes the house with Rachel, and there's a near miss with Melissa, and soon enough, Rachel and Jake are in Chapman's car, and Jake is refusing to leave Rachel, which gets increasingly difficult to understand as events unfold, while Rachel insists that he jump ship. Rachel knows that the only reasonable chance the Animorphs have of continuing the fight after this point will be if she remains in Catmorph and the Visser kills her before he's able to determine that she's not an Andalite. Rachel attempts to scratch Jake off, and he relents and abandons ship as they alight at the construction site. Two bug fighters fly out of the sky, escorting Visser Three's blade ship. They land, and a whole army of Hork-Bajir warriors and Taxxons file out, followed by Visser Three himself. The Visser addresses Rachel directly, something which she states has never happened before. She describes his mind as a black terror. In this moment of desperation, Rachel winds up finding solace in an unlikely, or maybe likely place. Fluffer's mind. This really isn't super unlikely. It's very foreshadowed throughout the book. Fluffer has all of the regular feline fears, but he has none of the rational fear of Visser Three that a sentient being would have. So by allowing the morph to take control a little bit, she's able to stave off panic, even as Visser Three presses her and she treats him with indifference. The Visser then asks Chapman where Melissa is, and Chapman discloses the minor host rebellion that he and his wife had to deal with earlier, and he emphasizes the need to be able to control himself in public places as an important member of society, being a high school vice principal and everything. He might lose all of that great power if his host is able to break through at the wrong time. Chapman then asks Visser Three if his host can address the Visser directly, to which the Visser agrees. Chapman, human Chapman, through slurred speech, which doesn't make much sense because he should be getting some practice every 3 days, reminds the Visser of their deal and promises to make Innis 226, host the Yeerk Chapman's name, as difficult as possible if Visser Three doesn't honor their deal. Nothing we don't know already, but this does sway the Visser, and as Innis 226 regains control, he tells Visser Three that he will do anything he commands, but that he will be more useful with a passive host. For whatever reason, once more, this causes Visser Three to relent. I'd be curious to know if there are any theories as to why this is the case, other than it being necessary for the plot. It kind of falls in line with the ongoing theme of the Yeerks being disorganized, and more specifically, a lack of commitment and follow-through when it comes to who they choose to infest, I guess, but I'm still curious to see what other people think. So as everyone wraps up their speeches, Visser Three's guard starts making moves to bring Rachel into the blade ship. As they mobilize, Jake pops up and asks her what's going on. Surprise, he's been on her back the whole time. He also tells her that Tobias should have tailed them with the rest of the group, and right on cue, explosions and Animorphs noise starts happening. So there's a battle, someone steals an earth mover, everyone fights, and Jake calls Visser Three a jerk. KA doesn't specify whether or not Jake is thinking at Visser Three when he says this, but I feel like he must be excluding him. Jerk seems like a very human thing to say. In either case, there's a lot of back and forth action that I won't recap in detail, but ultimately Rachel finds herself trapped by Visser Three. He's morphed this giant 20-foot tall rock monster with legs as big around as a redwood tree, a hint, I think, to the location of the Animorphs. Rachel is doing these cat acrobatics all over this monster's giant body when she does a huge kamikaze leap and is caught midair by Tobias, and the gang finally escapes into the woods. The next day, Rachel watches as Melissa opens her locker and finds a note that Rachel left there, typed out so as to remain anonymous. Melissa, your father loves you more than you will ever know, and more than he can ever show you. Rachel thinks she notices Melissa's a little more into cheerleading practice that day. The gang meets up later to debrief about everything that's happened, and Rachel brings up next time, and Marco reacts with mock horror before Tobias affirms, there will be a next time. There will be a next time until the Andalites return. And that's the book. A kind of cheesy ending. I'm glad Melissa seemed to perk up because of Rachel's notes, but it seems like a big ol' stretch to think that this will actually change anything. Something I've noticed in this series is that when the gang moves past a given conflict, it's often just put behind them. The book says a problem is solved, so it is. For me, there's a parallel between this problem being solved and the cop who tried to capture Cassie in the invasion, or the guy who saw Elephant Rachel earlier in the book. Obviously, these all have their own explanations, and the Yeerks' lack of organization and cohesive strategy is something we've already begun to establish and discuss on this channel, but I do think it's possible that this is an intentional reflection of what little childish naivete remains in the Animorphs. It's also possible that this is just KA writing to her audience. These are kids' books. Kind of. So let's get into the science and reasons. I'm going to give Visitor a 5 for plot. It's pretty straightforward in terms of structure. I honestly didn't find it riveting as a kid, and I didn't find it riveting today. There's nothing wrong with it. It gets the job done. For significance, though, I am going to give it an 8. We do learn a lot in this book. We learn about Yeerk hierarchy, Visser Three, the inner workings of the ongoing invasion. We also get some insights into the Visser's character. He's been pure fear up until this point. Black Sauron evil, but more of his actual character is starting to come through. Impetuous, aggressive to a fault, and dare I say, a little insecure. Time will tell. The book also reinforces the hints that the invasion gives us about Rachel and Tobias's little thing, so points for that. For character development, I am awarding the Visitor with a 9. The way that Rachel deals with Melissa, the guilt she feels for letting their relationship deteriorate, even while she uses her to get information for their mission, is a great harbinger of things to come for Rachel. This is going to scale up as the series progresses, but I really admire this as an entry point. It's just heavy enough to have actual moral weight, while still being a realistic conundrum that a teenager might find themselves in, alien invasion notwithstanding. Finally, for writing, I'm giving this book an 8. I think I'm probably going to wind up giving most of KA books an 8, although when we get to the Tobias books, I'm probably going to be really biased and inflate all of the scores. This is because I'm a sucker for angst. So that leaves us with a final score of 7.65, and it makes the Visitor second place of the 2 books that we've reviewed. How exciting. Stay tuned for more reviews. They should be coming out more frequently. Oh, and I do have a channel announcement. It's not really a channel announcement. I have a personal announcement. I'm going to be appearing on a podcast. It's called To All the YA I've Loved Before. I don't know specifically when it's going to come out, but I will make a community post after we've recorded the episode. We're going to be talking about The Unknown, the Animorphs book, The Unknown. So if you're an Animorphs fan, you might want to check that episode out. It'll probably be good. Thank you guys for watching.